Then the elders sharply turned to the left and entered into another fence field that quickly began to emerge as, I mean, really true jungle, and a jungle that obviously somebody had been taking care of. It was just too beautiful. Brightly colored birds flew back and forth. Stepping stones appeared just when you needed them. Everything became moist and green and manicured. It was more hotel-like than something that nature would come up with. But here it was, in the middle of nowhere. Then, surprisingly enough, but not really surprising, there was a beautiful wooden building blocking the entire valley floor that we were moving through. It was a structure built by the Mayans long ago to protect something that we were about to be allowed to enter into. The caves where the Mayan emerged out into this world long before Atlantis. To the Native Americans, it is called the Sipapu, and the Holy of Holies to them. I felt myself become very quiet inside. People were talking and realizing that food was about to be given to us, but the intrigue of what lay on the other side of this open-air restaurant was almost unbearable. The elders sat us down in this beautiful structure with the tropical jungle that was just coming in from all sides, and they gave us a traditional Mayan meal. We had a long journey ahead of us, but we didn't know that. But the elders did. They were just taking care of us. After our lunch, in single file, we began to move into the region behind this building. It slowly sloped upwards as we approached the mountain that was now in front of us. I became even more still inside, and I began to chant within myself as I walked closer and closer to something that I just really didn't understand. And then it happened. A small hole in the side of the mountain appeared, not much bigger than for maybe 2, maybe 3 people at the most to enter in at the same time. It took a while, but eventually all of us were inside the mountain in a long, narrow tunnel. We were now completely inside of Mother Earth. Somewhere in this tunnel, Don Alejandro corralled us all together and talked to us to explain a little bit about this cave. This was a very sacred cave for the Mayan nation. He told us that the cave continued for 28 kilometers, but that we were only going to go in for a few kilometers, and for us to be very careful as it would be getting wet and slippery inside. And this was obvious because it was already getting wet. We continued for just a little bit further, and there before us lay something that I didn't expect at all. The narrow tunnel came to an end in a T, and in front of us was another opening that was huge. I mean, it was twice as big as a football field and perhaps 75, maybe 90 feet high. And a piece of the ceiling had fallen in a long time ago, and a beam of light came shooting into the darkness and flooded this enormous cave with this angelic light that made you stop and open your heart. You couldn't help it. It was just instinctive. And then we all climbed down from this narrow cave, down an old ladder to the floor of this new cave, and turned to the left. We really kind of had no choice, and continued as a small creek weaved itself from one side of the cave to the other. We were constantly having to walk through this pure, crisp, pristine water. Most of the time, as we left this shaft of light, we had to use our flashlights to keep from falling into some hidden rocks or cliffs or somewhere. And it was very dark, and most of us just kept talking simply because we wanted to make sure somebody was there. If you turned off your light, it was completely black. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. After a very long and somewhat dangerous journey into Mother Earth, we again came across another place where the ceiling had fallen out of the earth, and it exposed another beam of sunlight to the interior of the cave. It wasn't much, but it was nevertheless, it made it possible for us that we could see. Don Alejandro stopped us, and he said that another ceremony had to be performed here in this place. It was another fire ceremony, but it was completely different than the first two that we had done at Lake Tatalan and Tikal. The fire was in circles. It was the most beautiful of all, as the music and chanting, it just echoed off the walls and within our spirits. Whatever happened within this ceremony was to determine our fate, but I didn't realize this at the time. All I know is that when the ceremony was over, Don Alejandro disappeared. It was one of the elders, a female, who asked us to continue into the cave and who then led us deeper into this darkness. It seemed to last forever. Then a third time, we entered into a part of the cave system that had another piece of the ceiling that had fallen in, and a beam of sunlight revealed kind of a roundish room that was huge, but it felt cozy at the same time. What I mean by that is the room actually had these giant rocks in it all over, and when you were sitting in there, you felt like you were in a smaller part of the room. It was these rocks that also made me and others feel kind of peculiar. I looked around to a woman who was standing right next to me, and she appeared to be deeply concerned about what she was seeing. She said to me, "Drumbelow, look at these rocks. They look like animals and birds. These rocks look like they're alive." I looked carefully at one that was near me, and it looked exactly like someone had carved into it a 6-foot iguana. It really did look real, right down to the tiny details. The rock underneath it hid the shape of a gorilla, and while the rock next to it appeared like a young male monkey. On the walls were human faces, Mayan faces that seemed to be emerging right out of the solid rock wall. And everywhere, every rock or wall was alive with something that seemed to be coming straight out of the solid rock. It took my breath away. I didn't know what to say to my friend, as it was very unusual. But I felt what she was feeling. This was not normal. This was not normal reality in this place. There was an energy that just permeated the very air we were breathing. Then I noticed that Don Alejandro, who had disappeared before, was sitting on a small granite ledge about 15 feet up the side of one of the cave walls. My first thought was, how did he get up there? Because it just seemed kind of impossible. And it was the moment when our entire group was becoming aware that Don Alejandro was observing us. We all became quiet, waiting for Don Alejandro to speak to us or to say something. Instead, he called for Rufino to climb up to him. He did so, but only so that his head was just level with this rock ledge where Don Alejandro was sitting. And then Don Alejandro reached into this rock ledge that was evidently filled with water and poured a handful of this water over Rufino's head. He did this 3 times. I had no idea what was going on. Then Tata Alejandro asked one of the world group to come up to the rock, and he performed the same ceremony with him. We were all just watching, what was going on. Then he asked each one of us to come up, one at a time. At that moment, I'll never forget this. It was just like simultaneously, we all knew in our hearts what was happening. Don Alejandro was performing a Mayan water ceremony on each of us. We were being initiated in some way, and the energy of the room went deep inside of our hearts of every one of us that was there. Whatever Tato was looking for from us, he must have found it. I started to cry. I couldn't help it. Later, when we were back in a small Guatemalan town, about to have dinner, Don Alejandro, Elizabeth, his wife, and Rufino were sitting at a table together, and they motioned for me to come over and sit with them. Don Alejandro looked into my eyes and said, and this is a quote, "We have asked 2 other groups to come from all over the world to have this ceremony with us to complete our prophecy, but they could never pass the tests that Pachamama presented to them. But I want to tell you now that this group has more than passed all of our expectations. You are the ancestors that we have been waiting for." I didn't know what he meant, but he began to cry, and Rufino also began to cry. And Elizabeth, in her female strength, just looked at me and said, "Thank you. Please let all of the sacred group know that they are the ones that we have been waiting for. And now our prophecy can be completed." This was all too much for me. I couldn't help it. I just began to cry too. We just became a big table of babies.